Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this final session of the 8th Annual Graduate Fellowship Conference. We are so delighted to have Secretary Carter joining us, and we couldn't have found a better person to really conclude this conference and to better represent public service and everything that our fellows stand for. So I know the fellows are really looking forward to hearing from you, Secretary Carter, and your background is really relevant to everything that we stand for here at the Rumsfeld Foundation and what our fellows look to accomplish in their careers. So thank you again so much for joining us. And Dr. Cambone should be coming on in just a moment to start your introductions. But on behalf of Secretary Rumsfeld, thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Give Don my best regards.
Absolutely. And I think here is Dr. Cambone.
There he is. Hi, Steve.
Hello, Ash. How are you, Mr. Secretary?
Nice to see you. Steve and I have known each other for a long time. So since, I don't know when, Steve.
I started thinking about the same thing, and I must say I came up with blank. It was somewhere in the late 80s or the early 90s when we first started to talk to each other about the issues of the day. So here we are sometime later, carrying on a similar conversation.
That's absolutely right.
Well, let me do a brief introduction for the folks in the audience, and I say brief because I'm sure all of them are aware of your career. You're now at the Belfer Center as director there. Congratulations. But the other interesting thing for Dr. Carter relative to the Pentagon is he too couldn't keep a job. So over the course of his tenure there, he's had at least 4, right? You were assistant secretary back in the early 90s, dealing with the issues surrounding the fall of the wall and the gathering up of all of the loose nukes that found their way onto the scene.
The first North Korean nuclear crisis, too, by the way, 94.
That's right. That's right.
Big deal.
That's right. And we won't credit you for that, though. We'll
I thought we were going to war that year, Steve. That's what I spent all my time getting ready for that. Fortunately,
it was well, we reprised that, didn't we? Back then again in 06. I mean, it was a strange cycle. But in your second tour, you were director of what was then AT&L, and responsible for the acquisition and maintenance of force. Went on to be the deputy secretary, which essentially is the day-to-day management of the department, and then finished that tour as the Secretary of Defense Force up through 2017. So a marvelous set of things there. The rest, associations.
I forgot I worked for Cap Weinberger too in 1981, and then for Paul Nitze in 1983. You want to really go back in ancient history?
Yes, that's true. That's true. I'd forgotten that.
Long time ago.
3 very nice people that you had the opportunity to spend time with. Wasn't it?
Yes. Wonderful people. Wonderful.
They were all true gentlemen.
Yes.
But one of the more interesting things about your background that I'd simply forgotten was that you had that joint degree in medieval history, and physics, from Yale, I think it was, right? Summa cum laude, and then off to Oxford, where you were a theoretical physics degree. So an interesting academic background to go along with a career that has spanned a good deal of time and events over the last, well, gosh, it's now we're talking 40 some odd years, right? 50 years.
40, yeah.
We're getting old, Ash.
I'm just sorry to say it, Steve.
So why don't we start maybe with a little perspective. You come on the scene fairly senior levels in the early 80s. The world is a significantly different place at that time. And now here we are 40 years later, dealing with a world that has changed in some ways dramatically, and in other ways, there are very similar issues we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Could you help us sort of understand from your perspective things that are substantially different? I mean, in the way that cause us to want to think differently. And then those things which are maybe continuing as issues that we simply have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the differences. When I started out, there was one biggie, and that's where all my energy was focused in the early part of my career. By the way, you're right, I am a physicist, and that's how I got into this whole business, via the nuclear weapons and technology side. Cold War was raging, and that was the issue. Everything else was subsidiary to that. So there was one major strategic issue. And of course, now, today, there are, by my count, at least 5: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism. So we have to spread our bets much more now than we did then. Now, none of those opponents is as formidable and implacable as was the Soviet Union, although China is getting there. But still, as Secretary of Defense or as a nation, we don't have the luxury of focusing here, there, and the other place. We got to do it all. And I also am highly mindful, Steve, that during my time and Don Rumsfeld's time and all of these last 2 decades, we have been involved also nonstop in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that was a major preoccupation of me in all my jobs. It has to be. If we have people at war, which we did, you're all in as Secretary of Defense, or as the number 2, or as the number 3. And people may not realize that, but we were. And I realize people debate whether we needed to be in those wars and all that kind of thing. But that doesn't matter when you're in the job and you got kids at war. That is job one. That's what you wake up to every morning and what you go to bed to every night. Now, that's not China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, or well, it is terrorism, I guess, in some ways. But that was a big preoccupation for us also. Now, what hasn't changed, I would say, is Vladimir Putin. When I met with Boris Yeltsin in the early 90s with President Clinton, sitting back in the back, taking notes, was a guy named Vladimir Putin. And we knew then well, you don't have to guess what the guy thinks. He says what he thinks, right? He wishes the Soviet Union had never ended. He wishes that Russia was still the big shot it once was. He uses all of the KGB-like tactics to pursue that aim. So in that sense, it's not all that different from dealing with the Soviet Union when I first started in the early 1980s. China at that time was insignificant. And everybody knew it would be big someday. I think we still hoped. I stopped hoping around 2000, Steve, but I think most Americans kept hoping until about 2010 that China would turn out better than it has, or that it would turn out like we wanted it to turn out, but it didn't. It turned out the way it wanted to turn out, and that's reality. So that's different. So yeah, it's a different world. I still think, though, Steve, there are 2 things that are keys to our strength, and we're that also. The first is technology. Well, actually, I should say the second. The first is really people. Getting good people to be part of the military and more generally the government, so that we have real competence and excellence working for our country. And then the other is good technology. And the context for both those things is very different today. So those statements are still true, but the way you go about getting good people today, the way you go about getting good technology are very different from the way they were when I started out.
I agree with that. And so let me come back to that by way of asking you to do a comparison, if you would, between the Soviet Union and the Chinese, the PRC, in their style, the cultural approach, and the implications, therefore, for U.S. policy, the geopolitics associated with it as well, but the implications of their similarities and differences for American policy, to take us then to the kind of people and the kind of capability we're going to need to have as we go forward.
Well, the Soviet Union, first of all, really did try for a number of decades to say that their system was not only the best for them, but the best for everybody. The Chinese, one of the problems with the Chinese today is, and I'll just say this bluntly, is that America at her best, and most of our friends and allies at their best, believe in the values of the Enlightenment. What in those days, in that time, was called, the dignity of man. Today we say the dignity of people. But at our best, our ideology is universal, all people, and our values apply to all people. For China, it really begins and ends with being Chinese. And if you're not Chinese, you're kind of out of luck in the Chinese worldview. Whereas if you weren't American, we've never said that made you out of luck. And even the Soviets in their most universalist days didn't say that if you weren't Russian, you're out of luck. But the Chinese, it's kind of, if you're not Chinese, you can get along with them, but you're always going to be sort of second fiddle to me. And if you're not Chinese, there's not a thing you can do about that. The other thing that makes the Chinese threat difficult is that in the Soviet Union, we never traded with them. We just built an impermeable membrane around them. And Steve, you and I both worked enough in export controls during those days to know that our policy toward them was, you ain't getting nothing of ours or anything that the West makes. That's an unrealistic proposition. So we have to have what is essentially a geostrategic competition with a major power, now China, with which we trade. That's new. That's much more complicated. And you see us basically struggling with that. That's where the tariffs and the trade war and all that comes from. We're trying to create a playbook for an entirely different kind of situation. The last thing I'd say, Steve, I always say this to people. I hear people saying all the time the Chinese are about to overtake us. I don't really buy that. I'll tell you why. And they're trying, and someday, they're certainly getting better and better. I say that for the following reasons. Even today, we spend more than they do. We have a bigger force than they have. And moreover, we have spent more than they have spent for decades, which means we have this great big accumulated capital stock of stuff that they don't have. Next, our military is much more experienced than theirs. Our guys have been at war, sort of nonstop. And so their operational experience is formidable. And I'd put them up against the Chinese officer corps anytime. And then the third thing is, if we behave ourselves, we'll have all the friends and they won't have any. And that's an advantage. Obviously, we need to behave ourselves for that to be true. I believe that it's important to have friends and allies, and I think they're force multipliers. And so it's fine to have tough, candid conversations with them, but it's not good to piss them off publicly because they're, as I say, they're force multipliers.
It rarely brings profit to make your friends unhappy. So your insight, and I share it, Ash, that we're in this complex relationship with the Chinese, where we're competing with them at the very same time. Each of us is an important trading partner for the other. So combining those two things gets to be terribly important, it seems to me, with respect to the other trading blocks that one can identify. So that brings us to sort of the relationship with our European friends, and whether that relationship has grown past NATO. Is it now a separate or a discrete or a distinct interest that we now have there from NATO? Are the two still combined? The Chinese don't see it that way.
I don't think so. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I believe that Europe, for all, we've complained to each other. I did it, Don Rumsfeld did it, Bob Gates did it, Bill Perry. We've all complained to the Europeans about spending more. Yeah, I mean, you've sat at those meetings in Brussels where we savaged them, but we did it privately. And so it's a frustration, but that still doesn't mean it's not as good to have them on your side as to have them not on your side. It is good to have them on our side. And the first reason is that Europe, if you just look at the globe and you say, where are there people who share basic American values? Europe is one of the few places you can point. That matters, I think. So they're natural friends. They are geostrategic friends because when it comes to Russia and the Middle East, they're well positioned, both in terms of their general views and also their geography with respect to those situations. So I think that they make a natural cultural and economic partner and also a natural military partner. Now, they're not the only bloc that matters. We've been talking about China, and everybody's interested in China, but I always remind people that China's only half of Asia. So I'll take the other half. If I can't have the Chinese part as a friend, I'll take the other half. That would still be a pretty good deal. And that group of countries is worth working with and keeping basically from falling into a camp where they are coerced by China.
So you were in the midst then of the effort to upgrade the relationship with India.
The relationship with India. Oh yes.
India, right? Yeah. And sort of in the forefront of that effort on the nuclear side and other elements of defense trade, and trying to bring their defense industry along to the point where it could be, if not a partner, at least a supplier and user of American technology capabilities. Say a few words about that part of Asia then, as making up a big half of that other half.
There's another big catch for us. They're a natural partner also. And I used to talk to Modi about this, and I'd say, I don't know what it is, Mr. Prime Minister, that makes it, in my judgment, destined that we will be partners. And some of it is cultural, but I also used to say, I spend a lot of time in the tech sector. That's my, one of my things besides defense. And about a third, maybe even more, of the leading tech CEOs, executives, and founders are either Indian or Indian American. So there's something that's compatible. between us and them. And strategically, we both want to trade with China, and we don't want to have World War III with China, but we don't want to get pushed around by China or isolated by China either. So we have all that in common. It can be difficult to work with India. It's a very bureaucratic government. You know, to be candid about it, they have a necessary continuing entanglement with the Russian military-industrial complex because they have so many legacy weapons. So, you know, you have to keep that in mind when you work with them. But I think that, as that's the word I always use, is destiny. I think we in India are destined to be strategic partners.
So let me bring you then just a little closer back to China, and then we'll transition to people and tech. But what about Southeast Asia and the way the situation is unfolding there? And then if we go around the other side, Korea, South Korea, and Japan. So let's sort of look at those two, and then we'll transition.
Well, let's start with Southeast Asia. I think the Chinese are trying to use the time now when we seem confused and numb to steal the march a little bit with our Southeast Asian allies. They need to be staunchly supported by Washington. And they need to have their spines stiffened because the Chinese are always out to pick them off, the way the Russians are out to pick off the Eastern Europeans. And so, you know, I do think it's important to stand behind them. And I think the Chinese are working on them hard, even including the Australians. And they got considerable distance with the Philippines, mostly because Duterte is such a, I don't know what the nice word is. With respect to Korea and Japan, they both have very important positions for us militarily. We need them both as a strategic foothold in Northeast Asia. And neither of them is going to assume that role unless the other does also. So we need to keep them both together. And Japan isn't so much at play now, although I worry about Abe's leaving. Abe was one of the most strategic leaders on the world scene over the last decade or so, up in the category of Merkel and Modi and so forth, real anchors. And he's now going to go. But I don't think there's so much in play. South Korea is, which is a reason why I am not in favor of torquing them around over basing costs. Yes, I mean, I've been there too, arguing with them over every nickel about basing costs, but I want our guys there. These people who want to bring the troops home, I don't get it. Why? Yeah, what? You know, do you want to get rid of them? Do you think they're unnecessary? Those troops in Germany, those troops in Korea, do you want to disband them? Or so you want to make the military smaller, or do you want to bring them to Colorado? Why? What good are they going to do us in Colorado? We just have to move them back when there's a war. So what's the point? So I don't get it. I don't get it. I'm happy to have them there. I think that's a little more stable situation, Steve, despite all the talking back and forth. I think that Korea has nowhere else to go but us, and Japan has nowhere else to go but us, and vice versa.
I agree with you there. All right, so let's get back to the other 2 points, tech and people, and let me please ask you to let's talk first about the kinds of technologies then that we will need to see come come to pass, well, let me rephrase that. There is a revolution in technology that is taking place. And we need to be thoughtful in bringing that technology into the national security space. Not all of it is useful. Some of it may actually be detrimental. So if you could reflect on that, and then let's turn to the kinds of people that we're going to need to master that set of international relations you talked about, because again, to your earlier point, this world is more discrete now in its parts than it was during the Cold War. It's not to say those parts weren't there, but the influence of the parts is different on us than it had been at that point in time. And the technology we need to master is different. So that would suggest to me we need to begin to think about different kinds of people and different ways of structuring personnel and all of those things that we've all talked about in the past. So talk a little bit about the tech, and then let's get to the people.
You've put your finger right on it. Not only has the technology changed, now we have the digital revolution, so AI and social media and so forth, eventually quantum sometime in the future and so forth. We have the bio revolution, which is just beginning, which will be as profound, including for security, as the digital revolution has been profound. You've worked in the, Steve, and been a pioneer yourself personally in the area of military uses of outer space. So there's plenty happening. And, to use an old Lyndon Johnson line, from my point of view, we want to make sure that we're the firstest with the mostest in all those areas. But here's the difference from when I started out. When I started out, all the technology of consequence came from America, and most of that came from within the walls of the government, military or space programs and so forth. We're still big dogs, don't get me wrong, in the Defense Department. We're still the largest R&D sponsor in the country and in the world. But we don't have the preponderant place we once had. And that means to be the firstest with the mostest with all the new technologies, we in the Defense Department have to have a really good bridge to the commercial technology base, because it's bigger than us. And we want to be able to suck all that good technology out and use its military applications. That in turn, and this is something that I made a big preoccupation of mine when I was Secretary of Defense, requires that we build those bridges. And that takes a different kind of thing. You remember after Sputnik in the late 50s, we founded NASA, DARPA, the NRO, which we couldn't mention then and we can now. And these new institutions to go out and use harness technology to compete with the Soviet Union. I think we continue to need new institutions, but they have to match the new era. That's why I started the Defense Innovation Unit, the Defense Innovation Board, Defense Digital Service, the Strategic Capabilities Office, because I thought that we needed to have kind of new places where everybody said, oh, that's what we need to do. We need to have outposts in the tech hubs of the country. We need to have people who are doing very agile, very fast development and acquisition. We need to have the best minds engaged in defense. So I did those things because I wanted them to stand for what I thought we needed in order to be the firstest with the mostest in a new technological era. I really believe we can do it. It means, you have to be a little flexible. You have to meet these people 50-50, meet these people in the middle a little bit. You can't, because they don't all want to do things the government way. So you have to kind of be flexible, but you can do it. And there are so many patriotic technologists out there. It's not true anymore that all they think about is making money and they're still annoyed about Snowden and so forth. There are a lot of people who have a much more balanced view of the world and technology and of national purpose than that, and are willing to pitch in and help us. We just need to create the mechanisms that'll make it possible for them.
So you mentioned, and I was going to come to those initiatives that you undertook, which quite frankly were long overdue. But I'd ask you to reflect on their relative success. So the SCO, the Strategic Capabilities Office, in certain respects has been a smashing success. Will Roper led that office for you, did a marvelous job. He's now Assistant Secretary of the Air Force.
Yeah.
And clearly timber for other positions, it seems to me. A good man. The DIUX has suffered a bit from being caught between stools at times. Got off to a quick start, and then inevitably the moles that eat at these things inside the building, right, sort of want to pull them back in. The digital office, another example of a group of people who have had an impact. And it suggests to me that experiences that we had relative to personnel management, and a subject of deadening interest to most people, put you right to sleep. Maybe, back to your point about people, maybe the single most important place for reform inside the Department of Defense of any single entity in the building. Would you agree with that?
I do agree. We've been talking about tech, and obviously I care deeply about that. And let me just say one thing about DIUX and so forth. My successor, Jim Mattis, whom I'd known since he was a major, he and I used to sleep on the floor of the Secretary's airplane in the early 1990s. So I've known him for a long time. Mark Esper, they have pursued the DIU. They made it not experimental, but DIU. So I think these guys, it's not just me and then I went away and things. I think they've stuck up for him and backed him. It's not their thing particularly like it was for me. Okay, fair enough. They're not scientists, but they've recognized the importance and stuck with it. So I feel pretty comfortable about them. And I think the best compliment that DIUX and SCO and everything have gotten is that they've all gotten copied. All the armed services and all the field agencies have their own little DIUs out there because they saw it work. They want to have one themselves. Yep. I didn't want, not everything has to come from OSD. I mean, so the best success is when it goes throughout the organization. I think this spirit has. Yeah, you certainly would appreciate that, Steve, from your own leadership. All right, people. Yeah, it takes more work than you think. And let me give you a couple of challenges. Let's start with the enlisted, and then we'll go to the officers, and then we'll go to civilians. Okay, 3 legs of the stool, roughly speaking. So let's start with enlisted people. We need about 250,000 of them a year. And about 4 million kids turn 18 every year. So we need 1 in 16, which, sounds like we got a lot of people. But remember, half of the young people who turn 18 are too obese to be in the military. I'm sorry to say. Another half of them cannot meet our intellectual qualifications. So, we really do have to compete for good people because we're the subset that we're willing to have in our all-volunteer force is not everybody who's out there. we're picky. I want to be picky. One reason, by the way, I'm happy to have everybody register for the draft, and I think everybody should, male and female. But I don't want to actually have a draft because I don't want people picked for me. I want to pick people. Now, you know, a big deal was made of women in service and whether, you know, and so forth, which was important because it's half the population. And I can't take half the population off the table when it comes to recruiting. That would be stupid. So that was the obvious reason for that decision from my point of view is I need the biggest pool. That doesn't mean women are as good as men at everything like loading artillery shells, but they're better than men on average at some things. But that doesn't matter. What matters isn't the averages. What matters is if there's a woman that can do a job better than a man, I want her. And likewise, if a man can do it, I want the man. So that's the gender thing. But people don't realize there's some other issues that we made some progress in that area. And I'm glad of it. I'm a little less happy at the enlisted level, Steve, with the geography. We still recruit mostly from 6 states, which are mostly in the South and Southeast, although New York is one of them. And that's mostly where the bases are and therefore where the retirees are. And so kid goes to high school, there's a coach or a guidance counselor, a teacher, a clergyman or something who says, hey, have you thought about joining the military? And in other parts of the country, you don't have as many of those people kind of basically as informal recruiters for us. We have to work harder. So if I were still there, that's one thing I would have been working on is geographic spreading out a little bit. Another one is getting skills that it's hard for us to get. You mentioned tech, cyber, and so forth. We need people with different skills, and we need to target that. At the officer corps, I think a really big thing is that we get absolutely superb people. And most of them serve incredibly well. Obviously, every once in a while, somebody doesn't, we get rid of them. And I always tell people that we don't put up with any, you see all this kind of misbehavior these days, sort of poor personal conduct. In the Defense Department, as you well know, we don't put up with that. If you're talking in a way that you shouldn't, if you're screwing around with subordinates and so forth, you're out. Because it's the profession of arms. And if you can't trust people in small things, you can't trust them in big things like war. So we just didn't put up with any of that crap. And we have plenty of really fantastically qualified people. I think it would be better for us if we did better in diversity, race, and gender, because there are really great people out there that we could have. But a lot of them don't. It's not that we don't have African Americans and other minorities and women who join the officer corps, but a real obstacle, Steve, is sometimes they decide to go with intel or logistics or rather than combat arms because they don't think they're going to get to the top in combat arms because nobody at the top looks like them. And so they decide to go with logistics or intel or communications or something. And that they truncate their careers at, let's say, the 1, 2, 3-star level. That's a hard thing not to crack, Steve. So I think we need to work on that kind of thing. On the civilians, people like to hate civilians in the Defense Department. And I used to tell members of Congress, our civilians are not people who sit at desks in Washington. they are mostly people who fix ships and planes, and they don't do that because we treat them well. You know, you cap their pay. Uniform pay keeps going up, civilian pay is capped. So we treat these people like dirt, but we need them.
Yep.
All those jobs, the jobs that the civilians do, I don't want military people doing. I don't want a Beetle Bailey military where half of the people are doing things that aren't military tasks. I want civilians to do it. And by the way, we're getting them at a bargain right now. So I would ask people to think twice before they disrespect the DoD civilians. But there you go. We've enlisted military and civilians, and there's a lot of management that goes into that. I found, Steve, that the best thing I could do for our personnel managers is pay attention to them and give them a mission. They felt, if they felt like they were going somewhere and they were doing good and they were improving, they were so much more effective. If they were just the dog that got kicked every time somebody complained to Stars and Stripes about their housing, allowance, they wouldn't perform. They needed to have, now, you have to, when there are problems like Surface and Stars and Stripes and so on, you have to deal with them. But they have to have a positive agenda, which is as positive as the technologist's agenda. And then they really get they really get enthusiastic, and they do a great job.
Yeah, I had a similar experience, and all that I would add to what you said there is the focus on middle management, either in the uniformed services or the civilian side of the house, is so terribly important for senior leaders to take note of what that middle management layer does in making the department a success. They get so precious little recognition. As you point out, they don't get paid a lot relative to the economy, that they deserve a bit more attention from senior leadership as compensation, if you will, and incentive, because they want to do well, and they want to do the right thing. And it never hurts to have been recognized for having done so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we may have exhausted you here, but Bridget, we have about 15 minutes left, I think, on the calendar, or on the clock rather, on the clock. And what would you like to take some questions from our folks?
Of course. Yeah. No, Steve. And, I'll take a couple questions. And just for the audience out there, anything is fair. I'm not picky.
And Ash, if there's something we didn't touch that you wanted to touch on, please, by all means, do so.
I think you hit all the biggies, Steve. I really think you did.
All right. So, no open questions. So let me ask you one. Let's go back to your medieval history days. How much of and the reason I'm going to raise this question with you is we've just changed houses, and I'm in the midst of reopening boxes of books. And I am discovering in this a trove of things that I was enthralled with in graduate school and in undergraduate school, and in which I'd forgotten. And then I started to reflect on the things that I did in my career and realized that, no, actually, these things did influence how I thought and what I did. Was that your experience?
Yeah, it was. And, you say, was I in physics and also history? It was a kind of right brain, left brain thing. And they both led to different tools in my career. History is, to me, the dominant mental methodology of real people. In other words, if you ask a leader or president, when a president starts walking around a problem that he's got, you can bet they're not using political science theories or economic theories. They're mostly saying, what is it that I've seen or heard of that's like this? And that's kind of where they start in their thinking. So, is Afghanistan, Vietnam, you've heard all these things, is so-and-so like Chamberlain at Munich. They try to use history to inspire them, give them ideas. And I found the same thing. I found that using historical reasoning was useful to me as Secretary of Defense. Even if something in the past wasn't exactly like something I was facing, maybe there was some tool they used, a method, some sort of committee or approach they took, and I could borrow that, even though my situation was different. Also, I made sure that when something new blew up in a part of the world, or if I were going to go and meet a foreign leader, I read up about their history, because one of the best ways to understand the world as it is to understand how it came to be the way it is. And so it really, you get a much better idea what motivates this guy you're sitting with if you know the history behind his country or her country and personality. So history is in many ways a really powerful tool in your hand. And it just takes, so I used to ask my staff, don't just tell me what our policy is and, this and that. Give me a little background on this place. And I found that tended to be one of the most useful to me parts of the whole, these big books you read on the airplane when you're going somewhere, Steve. But that was one of the most helpful parts. So history is the dominant mental methodology of real leaders in the real world.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I never sat in a meeting from the president to the secretary on down where a debate broke out over relative political science, quantitative methods in trying to resolve. Never, not at once. We got a couple of questions here. Cultural gaps between the private sector and the public sector, and particularly DoD, and more specifically amongst the technology companies. You made mention of DIUX and a number of other ways that you tried to bridge that gap. I think the question is more of that needed? And if you had another round or rev to do on this, what might you focus on next?
Well, you're right. A part of the building bridges between the tech world, that is the commercial tech world, and the defense tech world is a people thing. And we had some rough waters in that regard, rougher than we had, say, back in the 1980s. Snowden was part of it. And I found, to the questioner, that still you could find many technologists who understood that they couldn't take the security of their country and their world for granted, that government was an important thing and they had to contribution to it. And so there were those people, and I could find them. And I used to go out to these tech conferences and give basically pitches to these people. And, they'd have their orange hair and the rings in the nose and the ear and all that stuff. And I'd say, okay, that's okay. You think Edward Snowden's a hero, and I think he's a traitor. Let's put that behind us a little bit. I mean, don't you agree that you can't have a decent society without security? And don't you agree that if you want the government to do the right thing, isn't it more likely to do the right thing if people like you are in it rather than if you're out of it? And I could kind of make the case. for them to get in. And I thought it was successful. And I also think, to the questioner, that things have changed a lot in the last few years. There's been a shift in tech and towards more public spirit. It's really different from the way it was 5 years ago, much more even than 10 years ago. When I would try, I got a lot more resistance, pushback, and that's changed. I think that's for the good, because I mean, you don't have to look very far around our world to realize that technology is not just doing good things for us. Technology is doing some bad things for our world. And we need technologists to behave with morality. And I think one of the ways that you're moral is to join your government. And, you know, even if you're going to get in there and debate with people and so forth, you know, get in the game.
So let me follow with another question then, and talk about the profile that you would pull together of persons that you would want in senior civilian leadership in the Pentagon, right? Civilian leadership is the key, right? And at the heart of what we do. So what sort of profile would one want to draw on, the kind of person, the character, the background that you want to see brought into those kinds of senior positions, as the folks who are here in the audience begin to think about their own careers, right?
Yes.
Developing that profile.
Well, yes. And first of all, I read the bios of a number of you, and I was very impressed. You should be very proud of yourselves, and I'm sure you all have really bright futures, and that makes me feel good for our country and our world. And, you know, you can't game out every step in your life, but you all seem to, you know, be well on your way. I think there are two things that really matter, and they mattered to me, and they matter as I watch people coming along. The first is that there's no shortcut. People in government tend to be pretty, you think about politicians and politics, and it's easy to disparage them. The best of them and the best of people in the national security establishment are deeply serious people. If you're a serious person who does serious work, you'll get seriously noticed. I just think, you know, I can't give you any better advice than that. It's not a game. And most people are not these cheap shot people you see on TV all the time and so forth. Most of them are deeply serious people. And if you're deeply serious, they'll recognize it. And the other thing is, it's really helpful to have people who bring you along. If you have a supervisor or a boss or a leader or somebody who inspires you, and if they're a good leader, they'll watch over you. You know, make sure to link up with those people. I had a number of people. One of them was Jim Schlesinger, who was Richard Nixon's Secretary of Defense. For some reason, when I was a little nobody, Jim Schlesinger took a liking to me, and he's as responsible as anybody for the fact that I became Secretary of Defense. Brent Scowcroft, who died a couple of weeks ago, who was President Ford's National Security Advisor. These guys reached down and helped out people who were trying to enter the business. Now, we're a strange government, Steve, as you know, because we change out the upper layer of our government every 4 years. My sense, Steve, is that if you look at those people who come in and out every 4 years, I would say in a typical transition, that let's say about half of them were totally qualified and knew what they were doing. Another quarter didn't really know what they were doing at first, but were able, and they figured it out. I was in that category in my first job. I mean, it really is. And then there's a category that's just hopeless and never get any better. It's maybe another quarter of them. So that's not really bad odds, and it reflects the kind of society we are. It means that we're bad on continuity and institutional memory, but we're pretty good on freshness and new ideas and giving new people a chance. And so as you compare it to, say, the British system or other government systems, I think it works. I think it works pretty well. But my best advice to you all is stick with it. I really do believe in the long run that ability and good behavior are valued by the national security community. Don't lose heart when you see kind of, people who seem to be getting ahead by misbehaving. I don't believe that is on average over time. I certainly don't want my country to believe that, but I don't think that's the way your lives are going to unfold. So I thank you for the fact that you have the interest that you've already evinced in your lives. Bless you for what you've already done and what you're going to do. And, congratulations on having this very prestigious fellowship and having people like Don Rumsfeld and Steve Cambone to help you on your way.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you for a terrific hour. And I know your time is precious, and for you to have devoted it to us, we're grateful for it. So thank you for that, and good luck to you. This is going to be an interesting few years going forward, isn't it? And I hope we find a time once the pandemic lifts that we might find ourselves in the same room, maybe having dinner or something. Huh?
Well, always a pleasure. Good to talk to you. Good to talk to all of you.
All right, Bridget, it's over to you.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Steve, for those terrific questions and for the fellows. And thank you, of course, to Secretary Carter for such a wonderful session. We were so honored to have you on board as our last session wrapping up our annual conference. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in throughout the week. And we're really excited to see what's ahead for all of you, and hope you glean some really helpful knowledge from all of these top-rate and talented speakers that were able to join us. So thank you again, everyone, and take care.
Thanks, Ash. Take care of yourself.
Likewise, Steve.